The summer of 1959. A room on Lushan Mountain, China. A woman walks through a door and stops. Across the room sits Chairman Mao Zedong, the most powerful man in the world. She has not seen him in 22 years. She cannot speak. She can only weep. Her name is He Zizhen. She marched beside him when there was nothing to march toward. She carried his children and left them on roadsides when the revolution demanded it. She survived the long march with more than a dozen pieces of shrapnel in her body, fragments she would carry until the day she died. She gave him everything. He sent her away. This is her story. Welcome. It is good to have you with us tonight. There is a question that history rarely asks, not who held power, but who stood beside it. Not who gave the orders, but who kept quiet when the orders were given. Not whose name was carved in stone, but whose name was quietly erased. Tonight's story is about a woman most of the world has never heard of, and yet she stood closer to one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century than almost anyone alive. She marched with him when there was nothing to march toward. She bled for the same cause he would one day rule. She gave him children, and then she gave up those children, one by one, because the revolution demanded it. Her name was He Zizhen. She was 18 years old when she met Chairman Mao Zedong in the mountains of Jiangxi province. She was 24 when she gave birth to her first child on the road and left the infant behind before sunrise. She was 26 when enemy shrapnel tore through her body during a bombing raid, leaving wounds she would carry for the rest of her life. She survived all of that. What she could not survive was the arrival of a young actress named Jiang Qing, and the decision, made quietly by the party, that the revolution no longer had a place for the woman who had helped build it. Tonight, we go back to the beginning, to the mountains, to the marriage, to the long march that changed everything, and to the longer silence that followed. This is the story of He Zizhen. The mountains of Jiangxi province in the late 1920s were not a place for the faint-hearted. The Kuomintang, the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, were hunting communist guerrillas through the forested peaks of Jinggangshan with increasing ferocity. Villages burned. Captured soldiers were executed in public squares. The Red Army, outnumbered and poorly armed, moved constantly, sleeping in caves, eating whatever the mountains offered, trusting no one outside the circle. It was in this world, not a drawing room, not a university, not a palace, that He Zizhen came of age. She had been born in 1910 in Yunshan, a small county in Jiangxi, the daughter of a family that ran a modest tea house. Her parents sent her to a missionary school, one of the few places in rural China where a girl could receive a formal education. She was sharp, quick to read, quicker to argue. By the time she was 16, she had joined the Communist Youth League. By 17, she had helped lead an armed uprising in Yongxin County. She was not recruited into the revolution. She walked into it on her own. By the time she arrived at Jinggangshan in 1928, He Zizhen had already earned a name among the guerrillas. They called her the two-gunned girl general, a young woman who could shoot with both hands, and who had, more than once, led a unit of Red Guards against nationalist forces twice their size. She was 18 years old. It was there, in those mountains, that she met Mao Zedong. He was 34. He had recently arrived at Jinggangshan after a failed harvest uprising, leading a ragged column of soldiers through terrain that had broken stronger armies. he was already emerging as a dominant force within the Communist Party, a man of fierce intelligence, enormous will, and an appetite for power that those around him were only beginning to understand. A classmate of He Zizhen's brother introduced them. According to multiple accounts, Mao was struck immediately, not just by her looks, but by her reputation. A girl who had fought, a girl who had led, a girl who was already a legend in the mountains where he was still building his. They married in the spring of 1928. It was not a conventional marriage, and it was not entered into lightly. Mao had not yet formally divorced his second wife, Yang Kaihui, who was raising their two sons in Hunan, hundreds of miles away. That fact would shadow the marriage from its first days, though neither He Zizhen nor Mao acknowledged it openly. The revolution, as always, had its own logic, its own morality. In the years that followed, He Zizhen gave herself to both, the marriage and the cause, with the same fierce, uncomplicated loyalty. She served as Mao's secretary, managing his correspondence, organizing his papers, working through the night when the army was on the move. She attended party meetings, argued positions, held her own in rooms full of men who had been fighting twice as long as she had. And between the campaigns, the retreats, the shifting battle lines, she became pregnant. Again and again and again. Her first daughter was born in 1929 in Fujian province during a period of desperate movement. The Kuomintang were close. The army could not slow down. According to Chinese accounts from the period, the infant was left with a local family, a decision made not in a moment of cold calculation, but in a moment of raw impossibility. He Zizhen walked away from that house and did not look back. She could not afford to. A second child followed, then a third. Each birth came in difficult circumstances, in caves, in borrowed houses, in villages that the Red Army passed through and never returned to. Most of the children were left behind. Some died young. One son, born in Moscow years later, would not survive his first winter. Of the 6 children He Zizhen bore Mao Zedong, only one daughter, Li Min, would grow up beside her mother. And yet she did not leave. She did not ask to be sent somewhere safer, somewhere less brutal, somewhere where a woman's body was not required to sustain both a revolution and a marriage simultaneously. She stayed. She marched. She bled. In October 1934, when the Red Army began the retreat that would become known as the Long March, a 6,000-mile journey through some of the most punishing terrain in China, pursued every step of the way, He Zizhen was among those who left Jiangxi. She was pregnant again. She was 24 years old. She had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime. The march had not yet truly begun. In February 1935, somewhere in the mountains of Guizhou province, He Zizhen went into labor. The Red Army was moving. It was always moving. Enemy forces were less than a day behind. There was no hospital, no proper shelter, only a makeshift lean-to erected at the edge of a village, a few medics with limited supplies, and the sound of distant artillery punctuating the afternoon. A baby girl was born. According to Chinese accounts from the period, He Zizhen held the infant for a matter of hours. Then the order came to move. The army could not wait. She could not stay behind. The child was left with an elderly woman in the village. A small amount of money and a quantity of opium, used at the time as medicine, were pressed into the woman's hands. He Zizhen was carried back to the march on a stretcher, having given birth hours earlier, her body already taxed beyond what most people endure in a lifetime. She never saw that child again. It was the third infant she had been compelled to leave behind. It would not be the last time the revolution asked this of her. Each time she paid. Each time she kept walking. Then, in the spring of that same year, the bombing came. The Red Army was crossing open ground when enemy aircraft appeared overhead. The soldiers scattered. He Zizhen, according to multiple biographical accounts, threw herself over a wounded comrade to shield him from the blast. When the aircraft passed and the smoke cleared, her bodyguard, Wu Jiqing, found her lying unconscious in a pool of blood. The doctor who examined her found her body riddled with shrapnel, reportedly more than a dozen separate wounds, some accounts citing 17 fragments embedded in her flesh, including a piece that had torn open a long gash from her right arm down to her back. She was placed on a stretcher. She remained there, drifting in and out of consciousness, for 3 months. When she regained awareness, her first instinct was not to ask for help. It was to argue that she should be left behind, that she was slowing the army down, that her presence was a burden the revolution could not afford. Mao refused. According to Chinese accounts from the period, he told his men, "We must carry her to the destination." And so they did. For months, He Zizhen was carried through mountains and rivers and hostile territory, her body healing slowly, the shrapnel, much of it too deeply embedded to remove, remaining inside her for the rest of her life. She would carry those fragments until the day she died, not as metaphor, as physical fact. By the time the Long March ended in October 1935, He Zizhen had walked and been carried nearly 6,000 miles. She had given birth twice on the road. She had left behind or lost most of her children. She had survived a bombing raid that should have killed her. She was 25 years old. The Red Army arrived at Yan'an in Shanxi province, having lost the vast majority of the forces that had set out 14 months earlier. Of the roughly 85,000 soldiers who began the Long March, fewer than 8,000 completed it. He Zizhen was among the approximately 35 women who made the full journey, one of the smallest cohorts in the entire force. In Yan'an, the survivors built a new base. They carved homes into the Lus cliffs, cave dwellings that were cold in winter and stifling in summer, but solid, defensible. Theirs. Mao established his headquarters. The Communist Party began to consolidate around him. And He Zizhen, her body still bearing the damage of the march, settled into the life of a revolutionary wife in a revolutionary camp. She continued to work. She continued to support Mao. She continued, in the quiet moments between campaigns and meetings and party congresses, to be the person who had stood beside him since the mountains, who knew him before the titles, before the portraits, before the absolute authority. She had given him everything the revolution asked. She did not yet know that the revolution was about to ask for one thing more. Something was changing in Yan'an. Something that had nothing to do with the Kuomintang or the Japanese, or the long, grinding struggle for China's future. It had everything to do with a young woman who had just arrived from Shanghai, trained as an actress, ambitious, and very much aware of the man at the center of it all. Her name was Jiang Qing. Yan'an in 1937 was a world unto itself. Cut off from the rest of China by mountains and nationalist blockades, the communist base had developed its own rhythms, its own hierarchies, its own social codes. Foreign journalists arrived occasionally. Agnes Smedley, the radical American writer, was among the most prominent, and brought with them a certain energy that disrupted the austere revolutionary atmosphere. There were dances, there were theatrical performances, There was, in the evenings, a loosening of the discipline that governed daylight hours. It was into this world that Jiang Qing arrived. She was 23 years old, a trained actress from Shanghai with striking looks and a sharp instinct for the currents of power in any room she entered. She had joined the Communist Party some years earlier, though her credentials were not without controversy. There were whispers, never fully resolved, that she had at one point signed a document under nationalist pressure, a fact that would shadow her for decades. But in Yan'an in 1937, she was new, she was vivid, and she was paying close attention to Mao Zedong. According to multiple biographical accounts, Mao noticed her at one of the evening gatherings that punctuated life in the cave settlement. He began to seek out her company. He was 43. She was 23. He was the most powerful figure in the communist world. She understood, with the precision of someone who had spent her life reading audiences, exactly what that meant. He Zizhen, meanwhile, was not well. The shrapnel wounds from the long march had never fully healed. She suffered from chronic pain, from headaches that could last for days, from a physical fragility that sat uneasily against the fierce reputation she had earned in the mountains. She had also, in the years since Yan'an, become increasingly raw, worn thin by loss, by the accumulated weight of everything the revolution had taken from her. Those who knew her described a woman who had given too much, for too long, with no reprieve. One night in 1937, she found out about Jiang Qing. The precise details of what happened next have been told differently by different sources, but the outline is consistent across multiple accounts, including that of Dr. Li Zhisui, who later served as Mao's personal physician and documented what he learned from those present. He Zizhen, according to these accounts, discovered that Mao had been making his way in the evenings to the cave dwelling of Wu Lili, an interpreter working alongside Agnes Smedley. She confronted him. The confrontation was not quiet. Agnes Smedley herself was drawn into the scene. According to accounts cited in the New York Review of Books, drawing on Dr. Li Zhisui's memoir, He Zizhen attacked Smedley physically, holding her responsible for facilitating the encounter. Smedley, not a woman inclined toward passivity, reportedly responded in kind. Mao's reaction, according to the same accounts, was to tell his wife that she was behaving, in his words, like a rich woman in a bad American movie. He Zizhen had marched 6,000 miles for this man. She had left her children on roadsides. She carried his shrapnel in her body. And in the moment of her greatest humiliation, he offered her a film reference. The scandal spread through Yan'an within days. The Central Committee convened to discuss it, not, it should be noted, to address Mao's conduct, but to address He Zizhen's. She was formally reprimanded for behaving in a manner unbecoming of a communist and a revolutionary. The verdict of the party was clear. She had acted inappropriately. She was told she would be sent to Moscow. For medical treatment, the official language said. For continued political education. The shrapnel wounds were real. The need for treatment was real. But the timing was not coincidental, and everyone in Yan'an understood what the departure meant. He Zizhen was being removed. Quietly, efficiently, with the bureaucratic fluency that revolutionary organizations deploy when they wish to disappear someone without the inconvenience of a formal reckoning. She left in 1937. She was 27 years old. She was pregnant. She did not know, as she made her way toward the Soviet border, that Mao had already begun the process of ending their marriage. She did not know that by the time she arrived in Moscow, the Central Committee would have approved his request to remarry. She did not know that the woman who had just arrived from Shanghai would, within a year, become his fourth wife. She knew only that she was leaving, and that the mountains, the life she had built, the cause she had bled for, the man she had chosen at 18 in a world that was burning, were disappearing behind her. She did not look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back cost too much. Moscow in the late 1930s was not a kind city for foreign exiles. The Soviet Union was in the grip of Stalin's purges. Foreigners were watched. Chinese communists who had arrived seeking refuge or education found themselves navigating a bureaucracy that was at once ideologically familiar and personally hostile. The city was cold in ways that went beyond weather. Cold in its suspicion, cold in its silences, cold in the particular loneliness of being far from home with no clear date of return. He Zizhen arrived carrying the wounds of the Long March and the wound of Yan'an, one physical, one not. She enrolled at the Moscow Institute of Oriental Studies under a pseudonym, Ven Yun, attending classes alongside other Chinese communist students. She was, by all accounts, trying to heal, trying to study, trying to rebuild something from the wreckage of the previous year. In 1938, she gave birth to a boy, her sixth child, a son she named Xiao Liuhua. The baby died of pneumonia within months. There is no record of what He Zizhen said when her son died. There are no letters, no diary entries, no testimony from that specific moment. There is only the fact of it. A woman, alone in a foreign city, far from everyone she had ever known, holding an infant who did not survive his first winter. According to Mao Anying, Mao's son from his second marriage, who was in Moscow at the time, He Zizhen suffered a severe depression after losing the child. She was also, by this point, physically exhausted in ways that the Moscow doctors struggled to categorize. The shrapnel wounds had never been fully treated. The accumulated trauma of a decade of revolutionary warfare, of repeated pregnancy and loss, of displacement and exile, had left her system depleted in ways that medicine in 1938 could barely begin to address. To support herself and the children in her care, including Mao's sons from his previous marriage who had been sent to Moscow, she took in washing. She knitted socks for money. On weekends, according to accounts citing Mao Anying, she went logging to earn additional income. The woman who had once been called the two-gunned girl general of Jinggangshan was doing laundry in Moscow to survive. Back in Yan'an, Mao married Jiang Qing in November 1938. The Central Committee had imposed one condition on the marriage. Jiang Qing was prohibited from participating in politics for 20 years. It was a condition that acknowledged, without stating directly, that He Zizhen had been wronged. It did not change what had happened. It did not bring her home. By 1942, He Zizhen's mental and physical condition had deteriorated significantly. Soviet doctors, in consultation with Chinese communist representatives in Moscow, diagnosed her with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that many historians now question, noting that it coincided precisely with the period of her greatest isolation and loss, and that it served the political convenience of those who wished to keep her contained. Her symptoms, as described in available accounts, align far more closely with what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress and depression, the predictable consequence of everything her body and mind had endured since 1928. Regardless of the diagnosis, the outcome was the same. She was committed to a psychiatric institution on the outskirts of Moscow. She remained there for 4 years. 4 years in a Soviet psychiatric facility, in a foreign language, far from her surviving daughter, far from China, far from everything she had ever known or fought for. The revolution she had helped build was continuing without her. Mao was consolidating his power. Jiang Qing was learning, slowly and carefully, how to exercise the influence the party had told her she could not have. And He Zizhen was in a room in Moscow, classified as mentally ill, waiting for someone to come. In 1946, she was released. In 1947, she finally returned to China, a decade after she had left. She arrived in Harbin with her daughter Li Min, a woman of 37 who had spent the better part of a decade in exile. The country she returned to was still at war. The civil war between the communists and the nationalists would not end until 1949. There was no triumphant homecoming. There was no acknowledgement. There was no place prepared for her in the new order that Mao was building. She settled quietly in Harbin, then, later, in Nanchang. She was given a small stipend by the state. She was given a modest house. She was given, in essence, the message that the revolution was grateful for her service, and that her service was now complete. She was not invited to Beijing when the People's Republic was proclaimed in October 1949. She was not standing on Tiananmen Square when Mao declared to the enormous crowd below that the Chinese people had stood up. She heard about it, presumably, like everyone else, from a distance. In the summer of 1959, a woman named Zheng Ju was preparing to travel to Lushan Mountain in Jiangxi Province for a major Communist Party conference. Before she left, she stopped in Nanchang to visit an old friend. He Zizhen had been living in Nanchang for several years by then, quietly, without ceremony, in a modest house on a modest street in a city that had no particular reason to notice her. She was 48 years old. Her hair had begun to go gray. The shrapnel in her body still caused pain when the weather changed. She had not seen Mao Zedong in 22 years. Zheng Ji, who had known both of them since the Jinggangshan days, mentioned in the course of their visit that she would be going to Lushan, that Mao would be there. He Zizhen said very little. She did not, by her own later account to her daughter Li Min, allow herself to hope. But Zheng Ji, when she arrived at Lushan, went to Mao's residence. She told him that He Zizhen was in Nanchang, that she was not well, that she was living alone. According to Chinese historical accounts, Mao was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Zheng Zi to bring her. A car was sent. He Zizhen was brought to Lushan, told only that a comrade wished to see her, not who. She was led upstairs to a room in the residence where the chairman was staying. According to her own account, passed down through her daughter, she walked through the door and stopped. The person sitting across the room was Mao Zedong. 22 years. She had last seen him in Yan'an, in the days before she was sent away. She had left carrying his child, carrying his shrapnel, carrying the accumulated weight of a decade of marriage in the middle of a revolution. She had spent years in Moscow, years in psychiatric confinement, years in provincial obscurity while he became the most powerful man in China. And now he was sitting in a chair in a room on a mountain, and she could not speak. According to her own account, as she later recalled to Li Min, she could not stop crying. The words would not come. The conversation lasted just over an hour, and for much of it she simply wept. Not from weakness, but from the sheer impossibility of finding language adequate to 22 years of silence. I never thought I could meet Mao Zedong at that time, she later told her daughter. I really just, if I don't come out, I just keep crying. What they said to each other in that hour, No one knows with certainty. No transcript exists. No witness recorded the exchange. There is only He Zizhen's fragmentary account, filtered through memory and grief and the particular dignity of a woman who had never been given to self-pity. The next morning, she was told that Chairman Mao had been called away. He had descended the mountain. She would not see him again. According to Dr. He Zizhen, Mao's personal physician, who documented what he observed in the aftermath of the meeting, Mao returned to his quarters and sat in silence for a long time. He smoked, one cigarette after another, without speaking. Dr. He Zizhen, who had rarely seen his patient display anything resembling personal grief, wrote that he had never seen him show such sorrow. Later, according to Dr. He Zizhen's account, Mao sent He Zizhen 1,000 yuan. 1,000 yuan. For 9 years of marriage. For 6 children. For the long march. For the shrapnel she still carried in her body. For the years in Moscow, and the years in the institution, and the years in the provincial house where no one came. 1,000 yuan. He Zizhen returned to Shanghai, where she spent the remaining years of her life. She lived quietly, receiving a state stipend, seeing her daughter Li Min when circumstances allowed. She watched from a distance as Jiang Qing rose to extraordinary power during the Cultural Revolution, presiding over purges, orchestrating destruction, wielding the authority that He Zizhen had never been permitted to touch. She watched as Mao grew old and ill, tended by doctors and aides and the machinery of absolute power. She watched as he died, on September 9, 1976, without having seen her again. She outlived him by 8 years. In April 1984, He Zizhen died in Shanghai. She was 73 years old. Her daughter Li Min was at her side. There was no state funeral. There was no national mourning. The official announcement, when it came, was brief, a few lines acknowledging her as a veteran of the revolution, a participant in the Long March. The shrapnel was still in her body when she was buried. It had been there for 49 years. In 2007, 23 years after her death, a memorial hall was opened in Yongxin County, the place where He Zizhen had grown up, where she had first picked up a weapon, where she had first understood that the world could be fought for as well as endured. Her daughter, Li Min, attended the ceremony. It was a modest affair, a provincial memorial in a county most of the world has never heard of, for a woman most of the world has never heard of. There were speeches, there were photographs. There was, presumably, the particular silence that descends when people gather to honor someone whose full story cannot be told in the country where she lived and died. In the official history of the People's Republic of China, He Zizhen occupies a small paragraph. She is described as a veteran of the Long March, a participant in the early revolutionary struggle, a woman who contributed to the founding of the nation. She is not described as the woman who was discarded. She is not described as the woman who spent 4 years in a Soviet psychiatric institution, while the man she had married at 18 became the most powerful figure in modern Chinese history. She is not described as the woman who sat in a room on Lushan Mountain in 1959 and could not stop crying long enough to say what she needed to say. She is not described as the woman who received 1,000 yuan for everything she had given. Official histories are, by nature, selective. They preserve what power wishes to preserve and quietly release everything else. But the shrapnel does not lie. More than a dozen fragments of metal embedded in a woman's body during a bombing raid in Guizhou in 1935, carried through 6,000 miles of mountains and rivers, through Moscow winters, through years of institutional confinement, through decades of provincial silence. That is not a footnote. That is a life. That is a record written in the body itself, more permanent than any official account, more honest than any paragraph in any history approved by any committee. He Zizhen was 18 when she chose the revolution. She was not naive. She understood that revolutions are expensive, that they consume the people who make them as readily as they consume the people who oppose them. She had seen it in the mountains. She had seen it on the march. She had seen it in the faces of the women who left their children on the sides of roads because there was no other way to keep moving forward. She chose it anyway. What she could not have known, what none of them could have known, was the particular arithmetic of the cost. That the revolution would take her children, that it would take her health, that it would take her husband, that it would take, in the end, even her name, replacing it in the official record with a brief acknowledgement and a provincial memorial that most people will never visit. What remains is what always remains. The mountains, the shrapnel, the hour on Lushan, when a woman who had given everything sat across from the man she had given it to, and found that after 22 years, after all of it, the only thing she could do was weep. She never went back to Lushan after that summer, but according to those who knew her, she returned to the mountain 3 more times in the years that followed. In 1962, in 1965, in 1975. Not to see anyone, not to ask for anything. Just to stand on the slope where she had last been in the same room as the life she had once lived. She is buried in Shanghai. The shrapnel is still there.